Hi everyone, welcome to the... Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Motley Stew Show. Thanks for being an ingredient to this week's dish. I'm your host, Luke Goldstein, and this week was a really hard week to nail down a topic. There was a lot of stuff to choose from. There were quite a few notable things that happened in the world of news and politics this week. We had the Oklahoma House Education Committee overwhelmingly vote to ban AP history because they felt it wasn't pro-American enough. We had Bill O'Reilly officially declare that the Holy War has begun, something that both major political parties have avoided doing forever. We had Alabama Chief Justice Roy Moore tell all of his lower court judges that it was okay not to give out same-sex marriage licenses, even though the federal courts had ruled that the ban in Alabama was unconstitutional. Now, any of these on their own would have been worthwhile for a week's episode, but this week the privilege and the notoriety had to go to this. Dr. Ben Carson, someone who I talked about last week and who I actually agreed with on the vaccine debate, decided to come out this week and say something that was incredibly dangerous and ignorant. Now, on Monday, Dr. Carson was on Fox News, and he said that the only way that we could beat ISIS was to actually put boots on the ground. Now, so far, I don't necessarily disagree with him. It's really hard for us to be able to defeat a group like this purely through airstrikes alone. There are gonna have to be people on the ground. The real debate is whose people are gonna be on the ground. It can't just be the US. It has to be a coalition of forces, especially the people whose countries ISIS is actually in. But that's beyond the point. But Dr. Carson kept talking and tripped foolishly down a rabbit hole when he decided to say this. Soldiers should know that they're not going to be persecuted when they come back because somebody has said, you did something that was politically incorrect. There is no such thing as a politically correct war. We need to grow up. We need to mature. If you're going to have rules for war, you should just have a rule that says no war. Other than that, we have to win. Our life depends on it. Now, off the top, that might actually sound like that makes sense, and parts of it I actually agree with, but let's break down through the high-minded oratory and say what he's really trying to say. No such thing as war crimes. The reason why this is an incredibly dangerous and stupid thing to say is because it has a ring of truth around it. Creating rules for war is silly, because you are always going to find yourself against an enemy who is going to break those rules in order to win. If both sides are not playing by the same rules, the advantage is always tilted in one's favor. Yet acting like rules shouldn't exist at all opens the door to a dangerous precedent, like nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, intentional genocide, and more. Actions like those are only taken by those who don't place any value on humanity. I mean, we may win the war, but who will we be when it's over? Let's take a stroll down memory lane and actually look at why we do have rules against war crimes in the first place. The first instance for rules of war being used by the United States was actually back in 1863. They were issued by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War under the title Instructions for the Government of Armies of the United States in the Field. It was also known as the Lieber Code, after its author, Francis Lieber. Later on, the term war crime came into existence in 1906. It was defined as a crime as genocide or maltreatment of prisoners committed during or in connection with war. Another definition was an act committed during a war that violates international law, usually because it is cruel, unfair, etc. Most recently, war crimes legislation was actually codified at the International Criminal Court, which is housed at The Hague and was created back in 2002. Now, although this has been ratified by 90 different countries, it is still not ratified by China, Russia, and the US. I mean, that's really the company we're keeping at the moment. It wasn't until 1993, during the Yugoslavian and Rwandan genocide crises, that sexual violence and rape was actually added to the list of war crimes, which according to Dr. Ben Carson should be just on the table if we need to do it to win. His rhetoric on Monday was called out pretty quickly by a lot of people, but he decided to follow it up with an op-ed in the Washington Times on Tuesday to explain himself. Now, if people are hounding you about something you said about how to win a war and they don't think you're right or that you've stepped over the line, what's the best thing to do? Maybe just to go to the most famous warrior in modern Western history and quote him, because that will just make everything okay. Carson dropped this into his op-ed. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terrors. Victory however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival. Winston Churchill. See? One of the greatest military leaders of all time says it's okay, right? So it's fine. Of course, Churchill is long since dead, so we can't ask him, but Dr. Carson also compounds on this right-wing view of history with blinders on, that talking about the US like this: our innovation and compassion have provided one of the highest standards of living in the world, while lifting conditions in many other nations. I think there are a few people who might actually disagree that we have the highest standard of living in the world. I mean, maybe the people who actually lived here before we got here. Maybe the people who built the railroads, or tended the fields. Just to name a few. Now, the United States has been and will continue to be one of the greatest experiments in democracy the world has ever known, but we have to admit we have stumbled horrifically along the way. The banner belief in American exceptionalism has a bad habit of making exceptions for our failures, but shining spotlights on our successes. That kind of one-sided retelling of history dooms us to just repeat the same mistakes. Now, bringing it back to the topic of war crimes, Dr. Carson is not that far off the reservation when he says it is hard to create rules for war, but to say that there should be no rules for war sacrifices our humanity, our ethics, and our morals to the sewer bin of history. It becomes the ultimate example of how are we different from them. So what do you think? Should war crimes still be legitimate? If so, who should oversee them and prosecute? Should we change what is considered a war crime? Should we update it, make them more, make them less? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks again for watching another episode of the Motley Stew Show. You can like, favorite, share, subscribe. I'd be all sorts of happy if you did. Stay tuned for next week, and as always, here's your little bit of Logan.
What does the door do?
Oh, shit. Oh, wow. Oh, juice.
What are you doing? Are you looking at the bus?
Okay, Papa, here.
I think there are a few people who might actually disagree that we have the highest standard of living in the world. I mean, maybe the people who actually lived here before we got here. Maybe the people who built the railroads, or tended the fields. Just to name a few.